Good morning, everyone. Welcome here today to the latest in our series of Our People, Their Stories. My name is Prue McCausland. I'm a member of the Friends of QV Mag Committee, and it's my pleasure today to introduce Michael Edgar. Michael was born in the UK. He trained as an actor there and performed in several theatre companies before coming to Australia. He's been in Launceston for nearly 40 years and has influenced and supported many in the performing arts area as a teacher, actor, director and administrator. Michael retired as Deputy Head of the School of Visual and Performing Arts in 2008, but has remained actively involved in theatre ever since. He's just finished performing in Of Mice and Men and is about to begin a one-man show of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Many of us have seen him in many roles over the years, but now we're able to get a glimpse of the person behind them. Would you please welcome Michael? Thank you.
Thank you, Prue. Leanne Moriarty, in her book Apples Never Fall, has one character who is attending a memoirs course. And in that course, she's told that if you're writing your memoirs, the first thing is to get a title. And that will influence everything else, and it'll set the theme. And I thought that's not very good for me because as an actor and a director, I never really knew what a play was about until I'd finished rehearsing it. In fact, very often until I'd finished the season, which actually isn't the best way to work as a director. So when Jill McPherson came to me and said, what's the title of your talk, I was really flummoxed. So I came up with all sorts of florid ideas, but we ended up with that rather simpler one, which perhaps will make sense by the end of the talk. I should also say that my journey from Simple Simon to Sigmund Freud is also from Michael Brennan to Michael Edgar, because I was actually born on Tyneside as Michael Brennan, an Irish Catholic family. And I did think a rather nice title would have been Crawling to the Sun, which does have a sort of metaphoric ring. It actually doesn't mean anything in terms of my life, but it does mean something in that my very first memory is of crawling along the passage towards the frosted glass door or panel at the end of our passage in our tiny little flat. Crawling sometimes just because I liked crawling and I was attracted by the light, the door faced south. Sometimes crawling beside my mother, she opened the door to Father Brown, that was his name, or playing with my one soft toy, a panda, which through the years, poor thing, suffered the indignity of becoming my football as I became interested in that sport. This was wartime, so we didn't have very many toys. At night, I would look out and see the searchlights crossing the sky, and I'd beg to go out and listen to the planes. And for the first 5 years of my life, I slept on a bed raised 4 or 5 feet off the ground. It was on the top of a metal frame, which served as our air raid shelter. And I used to love to hear the sound of the air raid sirens, particularly the all clear. I think actually mainly they were practice because although there was actually a bomb site just down the road, I don't remember any raids. Tyneside didn't suffer very much. Although I do remember being out shopping. Actually, I should have moved on a bit. I do remember shopping with my Auntie Maggie one day, and there was this tremendous sort of blast and bits of debris flying through the air, and we'd just come out of the post office, and we ran across to the fruiterers, and it turned out an unexploded bomb had gone off in Saltwood Park. And when we got home, we found that our windows had been shattered. But we didn't suffer many air raids, and my memory is of a very happy and safe childhood, no fear or anxiety. Of course, there was rationing. We had ration books issued by the Orwellian-sounding Ministry of Food. And these are our 1953-54, my family's ration books. So you can see how long it went on. And you had to register with a particular shop. There's the Gateshead Industrial Cooperative Society, for which our number was 25176. and you got a little yellow chit every time you shopped, and you kept it in the jar. At the end of each quarter, you went and got your dividend, usually about 1.9 in the pound. And when you went to there, you got these coupons torn out for tea, flour, whatever. I remember my mother cooking with dried eggs and dried milk. I think you only got one fresh egg a week. And we had a sweet allowance, lollies. I remember it as being 2 ounces a week, although I think I've read since it was 12 ounces a month or something. When it finished in about 1951, my parents, I think very wisely, kept the rationing going, but they changed it to a money value, so it was 6pence or a shilling. But we got about the same amount of sweets each week. I remember, that's also Saltwood Park, I'll come back to that. I remember once at my grandparents' house, a grown-up cousin coming back from the war, and he had a banana, and it was reverently passed round from relative to relative. And what I remember about it was black. And I thought for years that bananas were always black. And I thought I'd get a bit of it. I didn't. It was given to my grandmother. And still today, I feel a great sense of luxury, picking up a banana, just peeling it, and eating the whole thing. And ice cream. I remember after the war, the first time we learned that the shop down the road had ice cream on sale. We rushed down, and there were these tiny little sort of cylinders of ice cream wrapped in cardboard, which we took home and put on a saucer. And they were only there for one day, and then perhaps a few weeks later we heard again, there's ice cream down at the shop, and down we ran. Opposite our flat was Saltwood Park, which played a huge part in my life after the age of 11. The main entrance was 200 metres up Saltwood View, but opposite our front door there was this wooden gate, which was never open, but was used by generations of kids to climb over. And I spent a huge amount of my school days in that park. If you want to know what it was like, read Dylan Thomas writing about Cwmdonkin Park. He says it far more eloquently, but my experience of that park was exactly the same as his, except our park was bigger. It was actually quite vast for a public park. It had a museum, which had been the original sort of manor house, except it was built in the 19th century. But, it was very grandiose and Gothic and impressive. I was told I might have this trouble. Here we are. Sniff, sniff, another Junivilia. And yes, Junivilia. This is actually a picture of my first-class teacher with her class. It actually is a few years later. I started in 1945. This is 1949. But I think the kids looked fairly much the same. And I look at that and I think, God, what a sort of poverty-stricken lot of little urchins they look. But Sniff Sniff was a marvellous teacher. Her real name was Miss Smith, but, my infant tongue and all that. So she was Sniff Sniff to me. And all I remember doing A for apple, B for box. No, you didn't say B. You said A for apple, B for box, and F for feather in your mother's hat, which says something about, fashions of the day. But I really don't remember this taking very much time at all. In no time, I was able to read, and I and a couple of others were being taken to the next class up to show off our reading skills, which they must have loved, I'm sure. So I loved reading from the very beginning, and I was, avid for books. And of course, there weren't all that many books around to buy, and we really couldn't afford books. So I was determined to join the library. You weren't allowed to join the library for some silly reason until you were 8. But my parents said, when you turn 7, perhaps go and ask them. So on my 7th birthday, I went up to the library and knocked on this window, and they lifted this sort of, one of those window panes and said, yes. And I said, I want to join the Junivile library. And I think that Junivile ruined any chances I had of getting it. And an older acquaintance let me use his books as a library, but he was full of Percy F. Westerman and who was adventure books, and just weren't to my taste. When I actually got to the library, I found I really liked people like Richard Crompton. I hated Enid Blyton because she was a woman. And I fortunately didn't realise that Richmal Crompton, the writer of the Just William books, was also a woman. But I was well into the series by the time this... And I think, Richmal Crompton really was the start of my taste for P.G. Wodehouse and Saki and the Bodice, the Regency writer, whose name's escaped me for a moment. Anyway, I think that was a really sort of a good beginning. Come on. This is actually my school, and this is a couple of years later, kids assembling for Empire Day, believe it or not. But what I want to talk about was my debut at the Sailor Work. Now, actually, by the time my debut happened at the Sailor Work, my infant tongue had probably got round the fact that actually it wasn't Sailor Work, it was Sale of Work. And my class was supposed to provide the song and dance number on this particular occasion. Engelbert, Humperdinck's Hansel and Gretel, da 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 da, round and round and back again, with very simple choreography. Now, I think this is a sort of harbinger of my future performance career. I was not selected for the final cast. I was already rather proud of my singing ability, and my grandfather, when he'd come home from the plough in, used to regularly say, "Sing, Danny boy." And I'd have to sing Danny boy. But the news was broke to me that my dancing skills weren't on a similar level to my singing, and I wasn't even the official understudy. But come that Sunday afternoon, just minutes before the troupe was about to take the stage, it was discovered that one of the boys hadn't turned up, and they grabbed me. And I was told I was the partner, Anne McKenna. I was quite tall. She was the shortest girl in the class. Now, it would be an exaggeration to say there's a costume, but the boys had been encouraged to dress in dark shorts, white shirts, and plimsolls. I think I had a fairly nondescript jersey on, but also, to the entertainment of all, I was wearing Wellington boots. And that was to the embarrassment of my mother, and they were fairly unballetic, and I think the word galumphing was bandied about. I still maintain to this day I got the steps right. It may not have been at that Sailor Work, but certainly later, certainly before the age of 10, because we moved house when I was 10, but that I bought a second-hand book, this actual book, in fact, and it's Shakespeare's Cymbeline. And I seem to remember my mother saying, "Oh, no, it's a bit old for you." And, of course, that was a terrible challenge, I had to buy this book. And the first scene of Shakespeare's Cymbeline is probably one of the densest bits of prose he ever wrote, and I don't think I got past the first page for about 10 years. And actually, in a similar fashion, the first film I ever went to see by myself, and again I think I was about 8 years old, because looking up when the film came out in 1948, was Laurence Olivier's Hamlet. I keep forgetting to do this. Actually, before we get to that, I've shown you the park, and the park was this big place for me. But our flat was in a very sort of nice road opposite the park. Up at right angles were the avenues, which were terrace houses, as you can see in the background. This is a Victory party. And each avenue, we lived between Westbourne and Windsor, and each avenue had its gang. I was in the Westbourne gang, although one time after a fist fight with the leader of the gang, I was commandeered by the Windsor gang, but it only lasted a very short time. But most of the time was spent in the park, particularly at dark nights. We'd climb over the walls and into the park, disturbing courting couples. I had very little idea of what a courting couple was, but I knew you could make the man of the couple very angry by, whistling at them or shouting or whatnot. And I can remember often coming home, just before 10 o'clock at night, and there would be my poor father with his bicycle ready to go off for his night shift, and desperate for me to come home. And I used to always say, well, I haven't got a watch. They bought me a watch. I think very impressively, they bought me a watch on the day I took the 11 plus examination. Not when I passed it, but on the day I took it. But my father was also, he was a big influence. He was an autodidact. He left school at the age of 12, was a miner, a union official, led the local group during the national strike of 1926. And because of this, when Winston Churchill's Home Secretary brought the troops in and everybody had to go to work, he lost his job. And Winston Churchill was not a popular name in our community. And he had to go south and work as an upholsterer. And then when the war came, he came back, took a very menial job in a factory. But as I say, he was a bit of an autodidact. He was something of an intellectual in his way. And we got the Sunday Times, which was a very posh paper, which had theatre reviews. So from the beginning, I used to read about it. I had no idea what it was, really. And somehow I got the idea that I should go and see Laurence Olivier's Hamlet. I suspect it was only because I'd read that in Manchester they'd stopped school kids going to it because the ghost scene was too frightening. So I think I just wanted to prove myself. And of course I've seen it many times since, but whenever I think of it, when I think of them, particularly that scene with Olivier sort of staring down at the waves beneath them and to be or not to be, coming as a voiceover as he thinks, I see it back there in that half-empty Odeon cinema in Gateshead. I can't say I really understood it, and of course it wasn't helped by the custom of the time. There was continuous performance. You just went along the cinema and walked in. So I came in the middle of Ophelia's mad scene, and then saw the end of the play, and then saw it from the beginning. So yeah, I didn't really make a lot of sense of it. I also that's the back lane of Westbourne Avenue. Mozart. Well, I didn't have any acting background, but I did join the church choir, run by a marvellous guy called Jimmy Rourke. And one of the first things we sang was Mozart's Ave Verum, beautiful piece of work. And I remember him saying, right, you won't fully appreciate this at the beginning, but like all great works of art, you'll appreciate it more and more. Well, actually, I did feel as though I appreciated it right at the beginning, but I did also appreciate it more and more. So singing was very important for me. And that's the church. When I went to grammar school, I remember asking my mother, will we do plays? So I'd never done a play, but somehow plays were, was of interest to me. In fact, we didn't do plays at grammar school. There was only one play ever done per year, and that was at the speech night, and the third form used to do it. But when I was in the third form, because I was a singer, I stayed on in the school choir, which was normally just Form 1 and 2, but I stayed on. In fact, I think I really was still singing at the age of 15. My maths master used to say to me, because for some reason I was thought of as a naughty kid, but he used to say to me, just because you can sing, you think you're the bee's knees. But a big influence on me was a man called Tony McGrath, Tiny we called him, he was 6'3". It was his first years there. He was a local lad, but he was an Oxford graduate. And he's actually mentioned in Sting's biography, because Sting, the pop singer, went to the same school years and years after me, and Tony McGrath had a big influence on Sting's approach to literature. But I remember Tony McGrath introducing us in Form 3, I think it was, and we haven't been Form 2, to the works of Gerard Manley Hopkins. And the first poem was Inversnaid. This darksome burn, horseback brown, his roll-rock high road roaring down. In coop and coombe, the fleece of its foam, flutes and low to the lake falls home. Well, immediately, things like the second word is darksome. You think, oh, that's an interesting word. And Tony McGrath said to us, this darksome burn, horseback brown. why horseback? And somebody said, because horses are brown. And of course, did that school teacher thing, if it's not quite the right answer, but yes, but something a little bit more. And I was good at English, and you usually thought I'd have the right answer. I said, because a horse's back is different shades of brown, so it's more than one shade of brown. He said, yes, but, and nobody had the right answer. Anybody here got the right answer? Because if you look down on a horse's back, it's moving. And the burn is moving like the back of a horse, and all these different browns and I was absolutely thunderstruck. Not just because suddenly the picture of the burn in motion was so vivid and I could connect it with the horse's back, but suddenly this is what poetry is about. It's not just rhyme and rhythm. You can use words like this. That was the start of something really, really, really important for me. A kind of love of words, a love of poetry, and I suppose this spilled over into drama. Enter Ron. The guy wearing the scarf, leaning over, is Ron Pickup, who Ronald Pickup, who is as an actor you'll have seen in, I can never remember the full title, the Hotel Marigold film. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury in The Crown. He was Neville Chamberlain in The Darkest Hour. He's very, very good career. Because I had a football injury, I had to stop playing football. So and I actually went to a football. My first week at university, went for a trial. Didn't do very well. I was really annoyed because I knew I was better, but I had this injury, which turned out later to be a medial ligament. But I could go back for a second trial, or I could go back for an audition for the theatre group. So I went for the theatre group, got a part, 3 lines as an Italian conductor. Consuelo, my violins and my bassoons, my trumpets and my drums, drink to your very good health. They were my first words on stage. And I played little parts like this for a while. Then in my second year, this guy, Ron Pickup, turned up. He was actually only 6 months younger than I was, but he was a year below. And I remember I wasn't in this play because I was still a practicing Catholic, and it was an anti-religious play. And somebody came and said to me, "You've got to come and see it. There's this guy, Ronald Pickup, and he's superb." And I thought, but he's playing this part he's on stage for 5 minutes. He comes on, has a speech, gets put into a cooking pot in the middle of it, and that's it. And I went to see it, and it was just, I was flabbergasted because, he was just brilliant. And, he was only 6 months younger than I was. And anyway, he was in the same hall of residence I was. We became good friends. And we were a little clique in the top floor of the all theatre people. And many of us wanted to go on to drama school. And I remember thinking, well, if I want to be an actor, and I don't know whether I'd already had the desire, whether Ron put it into my mind, I just don't know. If I want to be an actor, I've got to think that Ron Pickup is going to be a star, because I know I'm not that good. And in fact, I suppose Ron didn't quite get what you call, the sort of household name kind of stardom. But later on, when he was at the National Theatre at the same time as Derek Jacobi, I would have said they were very much on a level. It's just the way things happen that within the profession, he was very, very well known, but not quite. He didn't get his knighthood. So we both went to drama school, and he went to RADA, I went to Central School. We shared a flat for a while in London. Drama school was a whole drama in itself. I'm just going to miss it out because it was so complicated. I should say that about this time I was in the York Mystery Plays, and playing Doubting Thomas, that's me standing up, and you just trail around behind Jesus most of the time. But So you're in a lot of scenes, but Doubting Thomas has one very good scene, as you can imagine. And this was in York, and we'd get a taxi back, it was Leeds University, we'd get a taxi back to Leeds every midnight, and there was one of the guys who I had done a show for earlier, who was an ex-professional, and I remember him saying to me in the taxi, just suddenly out of it, he said, "You are going to go pro, aren't you?" And it was the first time anybody had kind of said to me, "You're good," you know, or that, to that extent. So that was a tremendous, fillip to me. So after drama school, though, there used to be a thing that Equity had that before you could go into the West End or the television, you had to spend so much time in repertory theatre. Now, repertory theatre was another world. I did do weekly rep for about 2 weeks. A weekly rep is where you rehearsed a play for a week. You put it on. I think you had a dress rehearsal. I'm not sure. You might have had a dress rehearsal on a Sunday night, or it may have been the Monday night, and you opened on a Tuesday. Anyway, you opened, did that play for a week. Meantime, you were rehearsing the next play. You rehearsed the first act, say Monday, second act Tuesday, third act Wednesday, ran the whole thing on Thursday, had a dress rehearsal Friday. The weekend you spent building the set, and then I only did it weekly for about 2 weeks, but I mainly did fortnightly rep in Barrow, Crewe and Chester, which are hardly bastions of theatrical excellence. This is me in Crewe Repertory Theatre Company in pantomime Jack and the Beanstalk. And I was Simple Simon. And my catchphrase was, "Savoury pork pie." If the Baron comes on, will you let me know? Will you all say, "Savoury pork pie"? No, let me hear you. Come on, all say, "Savoury pork pie." I didn't hear that. Can you do it again? Right, very good. Yeah. So, and I got my best review up to date, and in fact, my best review of my life. The Stage, which is the newspaper magazine for actors, used to do a review of all the pantomimes, and it said, "Michael Edgar shows real talent as Simple Simon." And I've treasured that ever since. My worst review, I played Pip in Great Expectations. And there was actually 3 Pips. There was a narrator, there was a boy, but it was me for just about every scene. And the local paper gave it a big review, a whole-page review. And it mentioned everybody and so-and-so's mum, so-and-so. It did not mention me. And I was devastated, as you can imagine. And I met the local reporter a couple of nights later at the theatre. I said, "Was I so bad?" He said, "Oh, I said marvellous things about you. I wrote 3 paragraphs about you all at the end, but they just cut them." And that's that usual thing of we've got to the end of our space, just cut from the bottom. After that, I went to London and I auditioned for all sorts of things, but I happened to, that gives you an idea of the kind of things. I've no idea what that play is, but I think you can sort of get the idea just looking at it. I auditioned for a play called Spring and Port Wine, which is already running, and I got the job of being understudy to 2 of the parts. And the company manager was a man called Ray Kelly. And who became a bit of a mentor. He actually became my landlord as well as the company manager. And I actually got the chance to play both the parts I was understudying for a fortnight each while the actors were away on holiday. And but during this time, a little guy who I'd been quite friendly with at drama school came to me, and the pub used to be just opposite the stage door, and you spent a lot of time. And he asked to see me. And he told me that he'd come into some money, his grandmother, somebody had died, and he wanted to put it into a theatre production. And he was organising a tour of Little Women. And he wanted me to play Laurie. And I was really impressed by this. And So I said, well, I'm actually under contract. He said, well, see if you can get out of the contract. And he had a list of where they were going. There wasn't anywhere really very flash. So I went to see Ray Kelly, who was actually a Queenslander, but in order to, and had been an actor, in order to get on as an actor in England, had kind of adopted this Charles Lawton sort of approach. And he used to do, I've actually slipped him into Christmas Carol at one point. And he used to talk like this, now, Michael. And I said, well, I've got this, and he wants me to play. And he said to me, well, go and tell your little friend that really that's not a very impressive list of venues he's touring. And you have a contract, and you are going to take over the part in 2 months' time. Now, that was the first I'd heard of this. And he said, you can tell your little friend that really he shouldn't waste his money, put his money in the bank. So I went back to my little friend and I said, look, they won't let me out of the contract, and actually I'm going to take over the partner in a couple of months' time. And I rather chickened out of saying to him, don't waste your money in the theatre. But if I ever meet him again, I'm going to say to him, don't get any grandiose ideas of producing musicals about cats or operatic phantoms or, you won't make any money, I did 700 performances, I think, of Spring and Port Wine, which was very interesting in many ways. My father died during the run of that, and my mother was very ill at the end. So I went back home and taught in school for 3 months, and then came back to London. And there was various possibilities, and very much against the advice of my agent, took one particular one. So in 1969, I'm in a rehearsal room at the top of the Old Vic Theatre. It's my first morning at Laurence Olivier's Old Vic Theatre. And we're apparently rehearsing a crowd scene from Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. And it's been directed by Edward Petherbridge, who plays Guildenstern, and Claude Chagrin, who's the movement teacher, because most of the company are actually in Bristol, which is 100 miles away. And at the end of the week, in a couple of days' time, we will be going down to Bristol to actually walk on stage in these parts. And Edward Petherbridge and Claude Chagrin don't really have very much idea of what's going on, because there's this whole batch of actors, some of whom have been in the play before, some of whom haven't. And nobody seems quite sure of what's what. And people keep saying, are you Freddie Pine? Is he Freddie Pine? No, he's not Freddie Pine. He's Patrick Carter. So you're Patrick? No, he's not Patrick Carter. He must be Lionel Guyatt. And I thought, And eventually realised they're talking about the actors who previously played these unnamed courtiers. So they need... And in the middle of this round of communal identity crisis, a fellow newbie, a big guy with curly hair, big eyes and an infectious grin, nudges me and says, well, I'm Tom Baker, and this is a fucking shambles. And actually, Tom later developed a whole comic routine based on Edward Petherbridge trying to keep his cool and having a gin and tonic sent up from the pub, which was just next to the stage door, and trying to look cool and nonchalant, but was rather spoilt by the ice rattling in his drink. So, a week later, took the train down to Bristol, costumed, herded to the side of the stage, took part in several mass sprints. They said to us, you've got to get on very quickly. And when you came to it, it was really like, what? And you're on, you're left at the gates and then back off again, and then back to London. And I think it was actually the same week that my first appearance on the Old Vic stage occurred at a Saturday matinee. And it seemed that the actors normally met in a pub. The play started at 2 p.m. The traditional half hour is 35 minutes before curtain. So I was a bit concerned that at about 1:20, my fellow actors were still ordering pints of beer. And I raised this concern, but I thought, not to worry. And indeed, a few minutes later, the stage manager, Jackie Harvey, came into the bar and ticked off the actors. I don't mean told them off, just mean ticked off their names. And this was apparently quite normal. A few days later, I was told to wait in the auditorium after a matinee performance of Way of the World to meet Sir Laurence Olivier, who'd been away filming. And I was sitting there for a while, and up the aisle bounds a stocky, middle-aged man who I didn't recognise at first because of his white beard. And I will tell you now, a metre is 39 inches. I am absolutely positive of that as of any fact in life. And the reason I know this is because he bounded up to me, extended his hand and said enthusiastically, "Oh, you must be Michael Edgar. I'm pleased to meet you. I'm Lawrence Olivier. Come and give me a hand. I've got some measurements to do. John Louis Barrow is bringing his troop across in 3 weeks' time, needs to know some dimension. Just hold this tape. Of course, they wanted in meters. A meter's 39 inches, isn't it?" And I said, "Yeah." Of course, immediately went home and checked it was. Now, that's in many ways typical of all my time at the National. It was often a shambles. A lot of it circled around the Old Vic pub, which was literally the dressing room that Tom Baker and I were in with about 20 other people. We were next door to each other, but dressing room 16 and 17, one opened off the other. And the pub was really underneath the... And I remember Sir Lawrence coming one day to congratulate people after a play, and I was the only one left in the dressing room. And he said, "Where is everybody?" I said, "I think they're in the pub." He said, "You must have a fireman's pole." But you also, as I say, got to watch some very fine actors at work. And I was lucky in a way that I was in Merchant of Venice, which Laurence Olivier was playing Shylock. And I had, I think, about one line, but they changed it. So Lawrence wanted to have, it was Jonathan Miller directing it, it was set in the 19th century, they wanted to have a sort of secretary figure. And so I became that. So I went everywhere, so Lawrence went. If you look at his mouth, it looks slightly different. He wanted to look Jewish, but wanted to be very careful not to have a sort of stereotype nose or whatever. And based on a board member of the National Theatre, he got some teeth made. And he said, don't tell the press, because apparently it cost a fortune, which slightly altered his mouth. And I, as I say, used to go everywhere with him. On his first entrance, he would sign a paper. This is one of them. Every night it would be a different one, and you can see the props department really, did a good job. And he would be holding a book, one of those books with blotters in it. He'd sign this. I would take his book from him, but I also had a walking stick, very ornate walking stick, his top hat on the walking stick, and a newspaper between other fingers, and it had to be folded in a certain way that when he took it, it would just fall open exactly right. And so it was very, I really had to be very careful about this. And I think I had a pen in my hand. I'd give him the pen, take the pen, I don't know where I put the pen, put it somewhere, give him the hat, give him the stick, give him. And I was so nervous at the first night that I'd get this wrong. And we went on, and Sir Lawrence immediately grabbed the hat, grabbed it, got it all out of, and said to me afterwards, "Oh, I'm sorry, dear boy, I was so nervous." Sorry. I loved being at the National Theatre. But it probably wasn't a good career move. I was playing small parts and understudies. My biggest part I played was Adam in Back to Methuselah, which with the wig and that was a sort of golden body wash that took about 2 hours to put on. I also did figure on the poster, and I had this strange feeling of for a few months of coming out of Waterloo tube station and coming up the stairs and looking at myself on a poster, which I think is the only time that's ever happened to me in my life. I know I've got to move on because if you look at that list, it was very, very kind of democratic the way they listed the actors. So I'm in there the same type as Laurence Olivier or Maggie Smith or Edward Woodward or all these others. And it was a great kind of social, it was a lovely time of life. Probably wasn't very good for my career. However, I did meet Cheryl, my wife, at that time, introduced by Ray Kelly, our Australian friend. From my point of view, typically I was with Ray in a pub Typically for Cheryl, she was coming to return a book she'd borrowed from Ray. So off I went to Australia, July 31st, 1972, 32-hour trip. I was third or fourth person off the plane. There was a baggage handler strike. So 2 hours later, with the effects of 32 hours weighing heavily down on me, I got the baggage to the customs desk. I was wearing a leather-fringed cowboy jacket, like the one in Midnight Cowboy, if you remember that film, which I'd bought in Los Angeles. I had a trendy shoulder bag. I had hair down to my shoulders. And this all seemed to interest the customs officials. I also had in my baggage a jar of Fortnum & Mason's juniper berries, which Cheryl had asked me to purchase for some recipe or other. The jar was taken away for further examination. I had to wait, and eventually they decided it was all right. And of course, those days there were these doors that used to open. You see all these people waiting, and after about 2 hours, there'd be fewer and fewer people. By the time I got out, there was nobody there, not Cheryl. And I remember looking, and there was Cheryl on the escalator, just leaving the baggage hall. And she happened at the top just to turn round one forlorn last time and saw me. I was lucky that I got a job very quickly in a play with Sid James, who was very popular at the time. And he did a play called The Mating Season. And he brought 2 actors from England in equity kind of rules. The rest had to be cast from Australia. And actors were a bit suspicious that I'd suddenly arrived, and here I was auditioning for this part, that there'd been some arrangement there hadn't been. And that was quite fun in its way, very different from the National Theatre working with Sid James. I remember him telling me, forget all this method crap, come on, face front, say that line as loud as you can, and I'll get the laugh. And I did, and he did. After that, I got an offer from the Melbourne Theatre Company to join a new exciting experimental group. And we turned up the first morning with a few actors. There's Lynn Lee, Alan Andrews, who now lives in Hobart and does a lot of work down there. Lex Marinos, who you may know, who was just starting out. And here we were for this new exciting experimental group, which was being run by a man called Simon Hopkinson. And as Simon talked, it became clear that, in fact, this was theatre and education, which none of us had known. I put the bananas in pyjamas because Simon Hopkinson went on to invent bananas and pyjamas, and also to write Lipstick Dreams, which was a great hit for centre stage. And I remember at lunchtime, Lex Marinos getting us all together, I think in the pub, and saying, what were you told about this group? And we all said, it was a new experimental theatre. So we were all very bolshy about it. But in fact, we had a whale of a year, although we kept complaining all the time. And I got married in the middle of it, which was helped make it a very good year. And then we created so much fuss that they got Simon Hopkinson to write a play called Stop Work about a strike, which was put on at the main theatre, and I was one of the leading parts. And the company asked me to join the main company. And the first play I was in was called Last of the Knucklemen. And I remember the list going up on the board, and I was actually playing someone from Tasmania, and I didn't really distinguish myself by saying, oh, look, I'm playing someone called Tassie. However, the play was a fantastic hit. It was set in a Western Australian mining camp with, 10 men who'd come from all over the place. You knew nothing about their backgrounds. It was like the director said, a fairy story. And I cut a bit earlier on that the first time I was ever on stage when there was a standing ovation was when we'd come back from a trip to Los Angeles with the first night in London of The Beau Stratagem starring Maggie Smith. And that morning, she'd won the Oscar for the prime of Miss Jane Brodie. So you can imagine, first night, she'd won the Oscar, up went the audience. The last Knuckleman at the Russell Street Theatre, I can remember standing on stage and seeing these people walking down the aisle with their hands above their head, and we toured it. That's me, by the way, the sort of half head that you can see behind the main character's shoulders. We toured it all around Australia. And for many years, I continued to work with that company. I loved it. It was sort of, that's me in The Removalists, as the removalist. Captain Cat in Under Milk Wood. Dazzle in London Assurance. And then I was very lucky that I got the part of the narrator in a two-hander called Beecham, all about Sir Thomas Beecham. And David Ravenswood and I toured that all around Australia. And it was one of the best experiences of my life. I also, while we were doing Under Milk Wood, they introduced a thing called Tributary Productions, which was just to be small productions. And I said, well, how about for Under Milk Wood, before the show or after, and in fact we did some before and some after, I do a little thing about Dylan Thomas. And so I wrote this play, which compendium really of his writings, which I called I Sang in My Chains. And the director, Bruce Mars, always said, don't like that title. I'm still doing, or I still did, the last time I did it was a couple of years ago in Launceston, under the title of Before the Fetch. Move on. Just before I left, about a year or so, I got the chance to teach at Deakin University as well. And Deakin University was this marvellous place run by, the performing arts was run by a man called James McCackey. A terrific combination of actual real community theatre, which really involved the community. And these mill nights, anybody could come along on a Thursday night and you'd go away in little groups, and 2 hours later you'd all come together and show what you'd done. And this most marvellous performance used to come out of it. But also, with professional actors, and in the student work, he really explored the boundaries of acting and what sort of non-naturalistic acting could be like. That's James conducting a mill night. The man in the white shirt, by the way, is Professor Jevons, the Vice-Chancellor, which shows the sort of repute which its performing arts was held by the university. A backwater of a backwater. Guess where? Tasmania. Not my words. About 20 years ago, one of my younger relatives at a family get-together in Edinburgh said to me quite earnestly, so what do you do for culture? I mean, living in a backwater of a backwater. But, I won't go for that yet. I must say, when I first came, it was a bit like that. Everything closed at 6 o'clock. I'd taken this job at the TCAE. I found it wasn't quite what I was expecting. Performing arts wasn't given the same sort of repute that it had been to Deakin University. I thought my wife was a little bit reluctant to come. Her story now is she absolutely did not want to come, nor did the children, and I dragged them both across. And I rented a house which turned out to have only one source of heating, and we were there in the Tasmanian winter, and it was dreadful. My wife, who was working as an infant welfare sister, found it very hard to get into the group here. They were very kind of, insular. And she was told off because she taught my daughter how to read, and that her first class teacher said, what am I supposed to do with her? And in fact, she had to sit in the corner and just read while and another teacher told us our son was slow, which, fortunately we sent to a psychologist, and this proved not to be. But I'll jump, because I think you probably should have my wife at some point, because the happy ending of this is that we both love Tasmania. And in fact, while while we were first there, and while bringing up 2 small children, was doing a degree through Deakin University, external degree. She got a degree. She went on to do a master's. She got a job tutoring at the university here, then was taken on the staff, got her PhD, became associate professor, has written several books, and when she retired, the money man of the university reported how she'd brought several $1 million into the university because she broadened their post-degree courses and sold them all over Australia. So really she had a very successful time in Tasmania. I can't really take the credit for that. I did not foresee that. This is one of our first productions, John Ball, in a centre stage production, which centre stage we started in 1989, John, Laurie and I, and went for 20 years, and we're very proud of what that did. It was very good for me. At this time, I didn't really do much acting when I first got here. And one of the things was, by the time I finished the Melbourne Theatre Company, I was in my 40s, still playing at one point an 18-year-old, I remember, and people seemed loath to give me, the meaty, more mature roles. And centre stage, it was really like I had about a 5-year lapse, and then I came back, did parts like Jock in the Club, and there's Ray Sangston, Jeff Hockley, and in Travels with My Aunt, Relatively Speaking with Carol Grady, and of course wonderful Stella Kent plays, which I did several of, Honour with Olivia Hamlet. My third standing ovation, I'll just say, was a student production with Stuart Lewin. It's a whole story in itself, which will take too long, which was not a very good piece of my teaching, but it was for one of my wife's conferences, and it was an international conference. There was a big guest speaker from America coming, and we were to provide the entertainment which opened the conference. And we did a musical, because I had music students involved, called Research the Musical. The conference was all about research. And I had a lot of trouble. Students hated it, and I don't blame them, because I knew that I wanted something really, really special. They couldn't quite see what I want, and I kept rejecting their ideas. Suddenly, Stuart Lewin came up with the idea that we did it like Club Buggery, if you remember. What were the names? Roy and H.G. on Club Buggery. So we did it like that, which also meant I was in it, which didn't, impress the students either. But all of the students then had, as guests, had their own little moment, and each had their own singing number. And we did it for one performance in Hobart, in a room very like this, with a small, it was a conference room, small ceiling, and audience sitting like that. And at the end, they just stood and roared. And it was most satisfying, because of the third standing ovation, but the first one I could really think, well, I think I had something to do with this one. And the guest speaker from America said, that was marvellous. Can I buy a video? And we had only one performance, and the stage manager was supposed to video it, and he left the equipment up in Launceston. So I know I've got to sort of come to an end. Just say very quickly, the other thing I'm really proud of is of helping to form Theatre North. I was on the committee of Theatre North for almost 20 years, but I don't think I really contributed anything as positive as I did just getting the thing going. There was a report by Roger Hodgman from the Melbourne Theatre Company into Tasmanian theatre, and he really just concentrated on Hobart theatre. And he was, as I say, he was running the Melbourne Theatre Company at the time, and he seemed to suggest it would be a good idea if the Melbourne Theatre Company opened a sort of second string down in Tasmania. And he said very little about Launceston. He did interview John, Laurie and I, but he repeated things that he'd been told in Hobart. The one that really annoyed me was that centre stage was just a sort of vanity vehicle for Michael Edgar, which was really very hurtful because we did lots and lots of things. And by the way, I should mention the mainstay of it was Peter Hammond, who did so many productions at Theatre Stage, with Centre Stage. So anyway, we went and saw the minister. Another report was commissioned by Gregory Leong, and he said, really, Launceston should be the equivalent of Hobart. We should have a subsidised entrepreneurial company, and that was Centre Stage. And that was Theatre North, sorry. I just threw this in. Malcolm, oh dear, I have these moments. My friend Malcolm and I did Two Fat Ladies round dinners and conferences for quite a while, till one of the fat ladies died and the bottom dropped out of our market. After I retired, one of my ex-students, Chris Hamley, asked me to come down and work at Port Arthur, which was wonderful. And I did that for several years. That's a play by Richard Davey, a 20-minute play called The Man Who Threw a Stone, which is one of the most satisfying plays I've ever done. Beautiful play. And I managed to keep going since. A week ago I was doing Candy in Of Mice and Men. I should say I couldn't find a picture of it. Of course I did do, after the Port Arthur plays, Chris Hamley formed his own theatre company, and his first production was of Sigmund Freud, and he played, oh God, my brain's just going. He played the famous English writer whose name I've forgotten, and who wrote the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and I played Sigmund Freud. Thank you, C.S. Lewis. That was great fun. I've most recently done Of Mice and Men, and over the past 2 or 3 years I've done one play about Dickens and one of him reading A Christmas Carol. And it's on December 10th and 11th at the Earl Arts Theatre. I've missed a few stories, but I think I'd better stop now and leave you some time to ask some questions if you wish to, if I've left you any time.
Thank you, Michael. That was just wonderful. Not only just going through lots of the plays that I've seen, but your wartime stories, the people you met, the plays you were in, trying to get your head around Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, which I totally sympathise with. I tried to teach that at one stage. But anyway, it was just wonderful, and I'm sure people have questions that they'd like to ask. But I'd like to ask the first one, if I may. What's Maggie Smith really like?
Well, funnily enough, I did have a few things to say about Maggie Smith, and I found it somewhat distant. The wardrobe lady at the National, I remember, because I had my 30th birthday in Hollywood, well, actually in Los Angeles, and we were there with the company, and I invited everyone to my party, and everyone came except Maggie Smith and her husband Robert Stevens, and I was a bit sort of, all the other big names came. And I remember the wardrobe mistress saying to me, do you know, a few years ago, Maggie was really down to earth and one of the gang. And I don't think it was that she'd got big-headed. It was just somehow that she'd become removed, you know. It was like she was in the star sort of position. But she was a beautiful actress. And I didn't have time to talk about the rehearsal room at, apart from the Old Vic, the other rehearsal room at the National Theatre was in a room very like this, but it was actually an old Nissen hut. And it had poles down it. So whenever you rehearsed, you had poles to. And I remember rehearsing Three Sisters to take to Los Angeles. And there were two things particularly I remember, because most of the cast had already done it. Laurence Olivier directed it, and but there were some people coming in playing new parts, and there was a flu epidemic, and I think Laurence Olivier and I were about the only people who weren't affected by the flu. So every day there was somebody missing, and Laurence Olivier loved just getting up and playing this other, including some of the women's parts. But going back to Maggie Smith, she played Marcia, and Maggie Smith in her younger days was the most beautiful woman, this ravishing red hair and pale complexion. And of course she was married to Robert Stevens, who became Sir Robert Stevens, who was playing Basheenan. And I can still remember, not the performances, not on stage, but in that rehearsal room on a cold January Friday afternoon, a run of the play, the moment when Marcia and Basheenan take their leave, and Maggie Smith coming running in, and there's just this sort of silent kiss, and they know they'll never see each other again. And it was the most marvellous bit of theatre. She was wonderful. So I didn't have a big personal rapport with Maggie Smith, but I felt very privileged to see some of her work.
Any other questions?
Michael, what happened to the name Brennan?
Well, there was a little fat actor called Michael Brennan, who you would see in some 1940s films. And Actors' Equity had this rule, which was quite reasonable, that you couldn't have two actors with the same name, which is why you had Harry H. Corbett and Harry Corbett. You had people. I did it at drama school, and they suggested it to me that it was better. I'm not quite sure why now to change your second name, and I tried all sorts, because Brennan obviously is an Irish name, but it's sort of not, it's not too kind of vulgar Irish. But I tried all sorts of. I may even have flirted with Michael O'Flaherty. But I tried Michael O'Brien and Michael, and then I had, from where I lived, which was in Tyneside, Michael Tynedale, or Durham, which is known as Dunelm, Michael Dunelm. But they all sounded a little bit too much, So Edgar was actually the name of a family friend, and I just liked it, so it became Michael Edgar. Interestingly, Ronald Pickup, who I had more stories of when he was at the National, but I remember him wanting to change his name to Ronald Shelley, because he thought Ronald Pickup was a bit sort of sounding northern. And I remember saying to him, look, people won't forget Ronald Pickup. Ronald Shelley just sounds, too much.
Any other questions? Well, I think we might have to get you back again so we can ask lots of other questions, because I just had the sense that you have so many wonderful stories to tell that that would be most entertaining. So look, I think I speak for everybody when I say we're so pleased you came to this little backwater and decided to stay, because you've done a lot, I would think, to giving us a bit of a presence in the country. So that's fantastic, and thank you so much.
I'm very pleased I came to this backwater.
Thank you.
Thank you.